So today we're going to be looking at taxonomy, systematics, and phylogenies. Let me start describing what the problem is here. When you look at the diversity of life on the planet, it turns out that there are tons of species that we share the planet with, and obviously one of the things that we had to do is to figure out a way to put them together, organize them, right? And basically what we need is a classification system. Basically, we need to take all of these species that we share the planet with and put them organize them in a way that we can easily understand them. That's what is called a classification system. Let me just give you an example to contextualize the problem that we're dealing with. Imagine that you are an alien species and you just go into this planet and you find this individual, this organism, and obviously the first thing that you have to do is to give it a name. You need to name it. If you are the first one to find it, actually you get to name it, and let's say that I call this guy the spoon, right? The second problem that you have to encounter is how do I organize this guy in relationship to similar guys that I find in this planet? Well, it turns out that we need to have something, a classification, a way to classify this individual. It turns out that there is a place called the kitchen, and inside the kitchen there is something called a cabinet, and inside that cabinet there is something called a cluttery organizer, and it turns out that in that place there are individuals that are very similar to my spoon. So as you can imagine now, if I get here and I'm looking for a spoon, I know exactly where to look to go and look for my spoon, and that's the significance here of us having a classification system and of course having a name. So basically, when we try to classify all of the species in the planet, you have two problems at hand. One is naming, and the other one is classification. In biogeography or general sciences, the actual term that deals with the naming and classification of a species is called taxonomy. Again, when you take the diversity of species on the planet and we deal with this problem of trying to give them a name and organize them in a classification system, the name or the study of that is called taxonomy. Again, taxonomy is the study of naming and classifying biological organisms. This idea of classifying a species is not new, and in fact, the first record of us ever trying to classify the species came from this guy called Aristotle that came out with what is called the Aristotelian system. It was, again, 300 years before Christ, 400 years before Christ, and basically, again, this one guy was the first one to try to classify organisms. The naming system that he used was basically the description of the parts of the species. So, for instance, something like me, he will say that species has hair, has a skin, had teeth, wax. So that's what he used to name the species. There was not a name per se, but rather a description of how the individual was used to look like. And as for the grouping or classification system, he has two groups. Everything in life he organized between plants and animals, and within plants he had subgroups that were small, large, and medium. And for animals, he had subgroups that were land, water, and air. So again, imagine you trying to have all of the species in the planet, giving them very complex names, and trying to classify them into either plants or animals, and within plants, small, large, or large, small, large, or small, or medium. Sorry. So obviously, that system created by Aristotle was not very good, because not all of the species could be easily put into that classification system. Let's just look at an example here. Again, if you look at animals, the general group was animals, subgroups land, water, and air. But if you take an example like the frog, for instance, well, it turns out that the frog, when they are adults, they live on land, but when they are young, they live in water. So in this case of this animal, it was very hard to classify this species on the taxonomic system that was introduced by Aristotle. So actually, 2,000 years later, back in 1700, this guy came along called Carolus Linnaeus that came out with a new system called the Linnean classification system. We use a version of this system even today. He's defined as the father of taxonomy. Well, let's see what he came out with. As it comes down to the naming, he decided to use what is called a binomial naming system. Basically, every species is going to have a name that is called the genus and a specific name. Basically, like every person has a name and a last name, he came out with a similar system. Again, he used genus and a specific name. Let's look at an example here, like Homo sapiens. In the case of Homo sapiens, Homo is genus and sapiens is the specific name. The specific name is also at times called the specific epithet. What about the grouping? the way that he classified the species. He came out with something called the taxonomy hierarchy, and basically what he did, he took species that were similar to each other based on their attributes that you could see, and came up with this again system called the taxonomy hierarchy, in which you had at the base a species. Species are grouped within genuses. Genuses are grouped within families. Families within orders. Orders within class. Class within phylum. And basically, he came out with this hierarchy in which individuals are clustered depending on how similar they are among them. Here's an example, for instance, for the grizzly bear, how is it classified according to the Linnaeus system. So again, at the base here, you had a species. The name of the species is Ursus arctus. Ursus will be the genus, Arctus will be the specific name. That is clustered within genus, and it turns out that their species shares very similar characteristics with the polar bear, and that genus is clustered within the family Orsidae, that is also a part of the panda bear, sharing again similar characteristics. And you can see how from the bottom of a species all the way up to the main, you start clustering species depending on how similar they are, and this is again the taxonomy hierarchy that Linnaeus came up with. Now, unfortunately, the system that was introduced by Linnaeus was not perfect. Let's look at an example. Here we had a bird and a bat. You can see that there are very similar attributes to these species, like they had wings and they had the capacity to fly. So again, those are attributes that you can measure, and given the system that Linnaeus used of grouping individuals by the similarity of their attributes, you could potentially say that these two species then belong to the same group. So again, this idea of what is called convergent evolution, in which you have the species that are in completely different pathways of evolution, having similar attributes that had nothing to do with them, but unfortunately for the Linnaeus system, it was very difficult to separate these things, because Linnaeus was basically grouping species depending on how similar those attributes were. And in this case example, these two species belong to completely different branches of evolution, but they are very similar. So that's the reason why the Linnaeus system was not quite perfect. Then this guy came about, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin came out and introduced something that is pretty simple, but it has been revolutionary for the way that we see evolution, life in the planet. And it's the idea that all species of life had a descendant that comes from a common ancestor. Imagine that. This guy made it to the history books just by making that simple discovery that all of the species that we see today come from a common ancestor. The significance of this for the classification system is that it allows to introduce a whole new way to classify the species that we share the planet with, and that's what is called the cladistic classification system. Again, let me just simplify how the classification system works. As for the naming, they are using exactly the same naming style that was used by Linnaeus, while to reinvent something that works very well and is pretty nice and simple, which is a species having a name and a last name, so to speak. But for the grouping, rather than using a taxonomy hierarchy in which species are grouped by their general attributes, in this classification system, those groupings are based on the phylogenetic relationship among species, how closely in the evolution of life those species are, and that then is used as a way to classify the species. This classification system obviously was a huge improvement to the system that was introduced by Linnaeus originally. Again, if you look at this example of the birds with the bats, you rather use the phylogeny, again, how the species are related over time. You find that using the cladistic system, the birds are in a completely different branch of evolution than the mammals. So again, that was a huge improvement in the way that we separate species in this classification system that we use today. Now, the emergence of evolution, of us knowing evolution and using that as a way to classify species, led to what is called systematics. Systematics is basically a field of study about the classification of organisms based on their evolution. This idea, again, that we can classify a species using this taxonomy hierarchy by looking at the evolution of those species. Basically, is the system introduced by Linnaeus and Darwin coming together on a single classification system, a huge improvement. So here it is. This is the taxonomy hierarchy introduced by Linnaeus. And here we have the phylogenetic map of life in the planet that was introduced by Charles Darwin, you can put those two things together, and now we have a very neat way to organize the species that we share the planet with, something that again allows to create groups of species that we can easily map along this map of how they evolve. So I'm going to introduce a few terms that I have probably spoke about that probably I should define. The first one is phylogeny. Phylogeny is basically the history of evolution of a species or their evolutionary relationships. So here is an example of a phylogeny, again, how the species are related to each other. And phylogenetics is the study of phylogenies. Basically, phylogenetics is the study of reconstruction of past evolutionary history of a species or taxa. Again, phylogenetics is a field of study that studies phylogenies. So how are these phylogenies done? You know, like how is it that you manage to create these trees that lead to the phylogenies? How are they created? Well, there are different ways to do that. One is what is called shared ancestral or shared derived characters. When you had a species, when you accept the notion that was introduced by Darwin that all of the species come from a common ancestor, one of the things that you will find is that there are characters left on the species from the ancestral species where they come from. That's what is called shared ancestral characters. Again, are characters that you see on individuals that are shared with the ancestor. And then you had obviously another set of characters, which are characters that are now new and specific to that species, and that's what is called shared derived characters. Okay, let me just give you an example. This is, for instance, the phylogeny of most vertebrates, again. And let's now look at the mammals right there. So when you look at the mammals, it turns out that one attribute that they have is this hair. When you look at hair, all of the mammals had hair, but no other vertebrate has hair. So in this specific case of the mammals, hair then becomes a shared derived character. Again, it's a character that is unique to that clade that is not shared with ancestral species. Let's look at another character, which is the backbones, which I highlight here for this species. Now, when you look at the backbone, that's an attribute that is found in many other species in common to the mammals. So in this case, this backbone is an ancestral characteristic of leopards, right? Because again, it's ancestral in the sense that the backbone is also shared by many other species on the phylogeny of vertebrates. So again, the difference here between shared derived characters are characters that are new to the species, to the clade, and ancestral characters are those characters that are found on the ancestral species. So with that in mind then, how do we build phylogenies using those type of characters, especially the characters that are derived? So here is an example. Here again, you have the phylogeny of the vertebrates. Here you have the different taxa, and here you have the different attributes. So basically what you do is you see the presence of these characters along the different taxas. And given these, whether the character is present or not, then you can go back and reconstruct the relationship among them. And again, this is one way to create these phylogenies based on derived characters, basically by looking at the presence or absence of these characters on several taxa. Another way to build phylogenies is by using molecules, things like proteins and DNA. It turns out that these molecules make part of every single organism in life, and basically what we can do is to sequence the molecules that make those things like proteins and DNA, and by looking at the similarities between these proteins or DNA among different species, then we can build these phylogenetic trees. Again, how similar are these proteins or DNA among different species, and it allows us to then create phylogenies that are based on molecules. Now, with the possibility of us now reconstructing how species are related to each other via phylogenies, which is a tool that is used in phylogenetics, now we can put all of the species together in what is called the tree of life. And it's a beautiful thing, no joke, when you start seeing all of these species sometimes sharing these ancestral or these derived characteristics, and how that allows you to then see how all of the species in the planet are related. And here is a general reconstruction of all of the species that we share the planet with. We start with 3 domains of life. We have archaea, eukaryota, and bacteria. The bacteria and the archaea and bacteria are pretty much the same thing, are organisms that had no nucleus, and the main difference between bacteria and archaea is that they had different molecules on their cell walls. The eukaryota, in turn, is divided in 5 different kingdoms, depending on the classification system, including plants, animals, fungi, and protists. If we go down the animal pathway, you will see that some animals are defined between animals, cnidarians, or bilateral. Bilateral are species that if you take their body and cut it in half, one half is going to be another copy of the other one. So if you take myself, you cut me in half, you will see that this side is very similar to that side, and that's why it's called bilateral. And you can look at many species that share that attribute. You take a fish, cut in half, you will see that one side is exactly to the other one. Turns out that that is a branch of evolution. And then within that branch of species that are bilateral, you get crustaceans, arthropods, vertebrates, mollusks. In vertebrates, then you get the mammals, reptilians, turtles, and you name it. And again, thanks to these phylogenies that we can build based on these characters that are shared among species, or based on our understanding of the molecules that make those individuals, now we can reconstruct these trees of life. Now, several times through this class, I had talked about this concept of a species, but what is a species? That's another thing that had turned out to be quite controversial in science. And in fact, there are 26 different ways to describe a species. So what is there are actually 26 different concepts of what a species is. The most common concept that is accepted the most today is what is called the biological species concept. The biological species concept basically suggests that a species is defined as groups of organisms that can successfully interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Basically, again, individuals that can reproduce with each other and having offspring that can survive, be viable. That is what is defined as species, and that term, generally speaking, is what is called the biological species concept. Now, unfortunately, there are problems with that concept, right? One of the obvious problems is asexual reproduction. Not all of the species in the planet reproduce by sexual mechanisms. Some of them reproduce completely asexual, meaning that you can take an individual and split it in two, and then you get two individuals of the same species. And the example of that is bacteria and the viruses. Basically, these species live life with no sex, but many other species, the ones that are included within the biological definition concept of a species, those species reproduce via sex. These ones multiply, reproduce without having sex. They basically split themselves in halves, and that's how they manage to reproduce. The other problem of the biological concept is hybridization. Hybridization is basically when different species come together and produce offspring that might or might not be viable over a few generations. An example is a zebra and a donkey. They go out in a date, and the result of that date is what is called a sonki, right? So here is an example again in which two very different species still manage to interbreed to produce offspring. So that becomes complicated in the terms on the use of the biological concept for this species, because they clearly reproduce and produce offspring. Another limitation of the biological concept of a species is this idea of the horizontal gene transfer. So basically what happens here is that there are many species, especially in bacteria and archaea, that they have been evolving over branches of evolution over many different times, and they have been separated for millions of years. Somehow they come together and they reproduce, and that reproduction still leads to viable species. And that's what is called horizontal gene transfer. That is so crazy in bacteria and archaea for them to do this. This is like having a whale and an insect, which are two groups of animals that have evolved in completely different pathways, putting them together and having a whale and an insect reproducing and producing another species. So that is exactly what is happening here with the bacteria and archaea, having lineages that have been separated for millions of years, somehow coming together, reproducing and producing individuals that are viable. So that's a huge limitation for the use of the biological species concept. Now, another concept that is commonly used to define a species is what is called the genetic species concept. In this case, this concept uses the similarity, the genetic or molecular similarity among a species, right? Basically what you do, you take these molecules, as I explained to you, either protein or DNA, compare that among different species, and that allows you then to differentiate different species, and that turns then into what is called the genetic species concept. Again, trying to differentiate the degree to which species are different based on their molecular composition. However, the concept is not quite perfect yet though, because unfortunately, what is the threshold that you use? At what percentage of difference you say a species is a species, right? So here you can see, for instance, the genetic similarity among different species on a given molecule, and you can see that these differences, molecular differences, are quite different between things that we clearly identify as different species today. So unfortunately, that's kind of the limitation of the genetic species concept, is the fact that it's very hard for us to come up with a threshold that will allow us to separate all of the species that we know in the planet, because as you can see here, there are clearly things that are different species that have different levels of genetic differentiation. Now, certain times you see me using the word species and population, but I want to clarify that those two things are different. There are certain times that they kind of can be used in the same way, but they are actually very different. As I explained to you, species are normally organisms that it can be either they reproduce with each other and the offspring are viable, or they are genetically similar. But a population, though, are groups of individuals of the same species. Okay, so I need you to keep that distinction in mind. Again, a population are discrete groups of individuals of the same species. Well, the species is what we just described. And that's the class for today, and I see you guys in the next episode.